Welcome to worship in the Unitarian Universalist Church of Charlotte. We come together today not because we cannot find deeper spiritual meaning on our own, but because it is so difficult to sustain on our own, and because we experience it so much more keenly when we gather in community. We come together today in other parts of this building, not because we cannot call our children to lives of meaning in our individual families, but because we benefit from the support and shared call they hear each week. We come together in congregational commitment and in pursuit of partnership with others, not because we cannot make any difference individually, but because we cannot make nearly enough difference in personal acts of kindness alone. Umair Muhammad, in his book Confronting Injustice, insists, the change we need will not be arrived at if we stick to the kind of activism that is commonplace today. We need to disassociate ourselves from individualism and embrace the social. We need to move beyond the local and see the global. We need to see the numerous struggles against injustice around the world as part of a wider struggle for global transformation. Transformation, he said, a whole new system of things. We come together today to awake anew, to wake our senses so that we might hear the earth call, to wake our reason so that we might reach out for the new, to wake our compassion so that we might heed the cries, to wake our consciences so that justice might be our guide.
light this chalice today in search of a deeper understanding of the interconnections of all people in all places as we strive to care for our precious earth and each life so worthy of its wondrous bounty.
As most of our most active members know, we as a congregation have made two primary commitments for this year: to explore two topics in depth, to listen and to learn before acting. They are racial justice and environmental justice. Many of you have pointed out how difficult you find it to distinguish between the two, and hopefully more of us will have that awareness after today's service, our first opportunity to reflect on this topic in this way. Our first reading today is from a young environmental justice activist by the name of Mayora Carter. I commend to you, if you're at all interested in this topic, her TED Talk called Greening the Ghetto. She's from the South Bronx. This comes from an interview with Mayora Carter, an excerpt of that interview. She said, "The environmental movement has traditionally left people behind in environmental sacrifice zones, which are almost always populated by poor people, usually non-white, but not always. So for instance, while the environmental movement may have had past successes in getting land preserved or making automobile emissions cleaner, it has not worked as hard to ensure that working class people living near preserved land can make a living through sustainable stewardship of the area. Nor have the oil refineries near where poor people live become any less toxic. If we had located," she continues, "if we had located our power, waste, transport, and mega agricultural infrastructure near wealthy people, like we have with poor people, we would have had a clean, green economy decades ago. Instead, the environmental movement turned its back on the point sources of greenhouse gases and pollution in favor of their own backyards and favorite animal species. The public health stats illustrate this phenomenon quite clearly. If we can turn the environmental movement into an environmental equality movement, I believe new allies will come on board with more passion and tenacity than we've seen before. Clean air, water, and land is not evenly distributed. Right? Clean air, water, and land is not evenly distributed. Poor people are more likely to breathe dirtier air, drink dirtier water, and live, work, or go to school on toxic soils. The hunger for equality will always be greater than support for cap and trade or some other effort that's not directly related to the lives of people. If we bring everyone together for environmental equality, many of the traditional environmentalist goals will surely be met as well.
Our second reading this morning is from Nikki Finney. It is an excerpt from her long poem, Left. People who outlived bullwhips and Bull Connor, historically afraid of water and routinely fed to crocodiles, left in the sun on the sticky tar heat of roofs to roast like pigs, surrounded by 40 feet of churning water in the summer of 2005. While the richest country in the world played the old observation game, studied the situation, wondered by committee what to do, counted in private by long historical division, speculated whether or not some people are surely born ready, accustomed to flood, famine, and fear. After all, it was only poor New Orleans, old bastard city of funny spellers, non-swimmers with squeeze box accordion accents. Who would be alive to care?
It's a 20-step climb from the sidewalk at 5909 St. Claude Avenue to the front entrance of McDonough 19 Elementary School in New Orleans. 57 years ago this week, on November 16, 1960, Gail Etienne, Tessie Prevost, and Leona Tate, the McDonough Three, became the first black students to make that climb. What a far different place it was. By the time I'd ascend that very same shaded stairway on Thursday afternoons in the late 1980s. My dear friend Ed Broussard was principal of McDonough 19, holding sway from a disheveled office with wide windows and a high ceiling, attesting to the school's handsome, if fading, grandeur. At my request, Ed had arranged an opportunity for me to tutor there, brokering a relationship with a quick, clever, impish student named John. So from a world away, I'd leave my peach-colored shotgun house on Annunciation Street, drive past the Central Business District, through Tremé, the Faubourg Marigny, and Bywater. I'd cross over the Industrial Canal on the narrow St. Claude Bridge and arrive several blocks later at the large, old, rambling, three-story school. There on alternating Thursdays, John and I would sit and do homework or escape together off to some adventure in the city. Early in the evening, we'd make our way back down narrow, rutted streets until we arrived at the modest home he shared with his mom and siblings in a block of houses in various states of decline and disrepair. McDonough 19 went from being an all-white school in 1960 to a school that, by the time I was making my afternoon visits there, was almost entirely black. Its surrounding area, built on the site of old sugarcane plantations, was home to Fats Domino, Kermit Ruffins, the Baptiste family, part of New Orleans' musical royalty, and to some of the city's greatest poverty. I could have never imagined that 2.5 decades later, the world's attention would turn to that neighborhood. When, as it is still called in New Orleans, the storm hit in August 2005, the destruction from that anything but natural disaster reserved its fiercest, cruelest fury for those few blocks around McDonough 19. You see, these just over 2 square miles make up New Orleans' now infamous Lower Ninth Ward. If, as activist Mayora Carter puts it, environmental justice is about no community being saddled with more environmental burdens and less environmental benefits than any other, then it would be difficult to find a clearer example of environmental injustice than this neighborhood. On the morning after Katrina crashed into Louisiana, when the Industrial Canal levee ruptured, John's old neighborhood was submerged under an incomprehensible 12 to 20 feet of water. Residents, among the 60% of poor blacks living in New Orleans who had neither a car nor any other means of transportation to comply with the mandatory evacuation order, fought the rising tide inundating their homes until they ended up either stranded on their tar paper roofs or floating face down in the fetid water. And whether desperate or deceased, there they remained for days. Because, as Nikki Finney puts it, it was only New Orleans, old bastard city of funny spellers, non-swimmers with squeeze box accordion accents. Michael Blum, an ecologist at Tulane University, equates the devastation of John's old neighborhood to a volcanic eruption on the order of Mount St. Helens. Sadly, that analogy may be more apt even than Blum intended. In both cases, the potential for devastation had been simmering just beneath the surface for a very long time. However, unlike the volcano's explosion, what happened in that little stretch of land in Louisiana can hardly be considered a natural disaster. Instead, Katrina's impact on the Ninth Ward has become a prime case study for environmental justice, precisely because it demonstrates so clearly the inconceivable horrors that can occur when injustice and environmental devastation swirl together to form a Category 5 catastrophe. Riley Morse, in a detailed study, explains that it started in New Orleans just after emancipation. It was then, he points out, when African Americans were forced to live in undesirable areas subject to frequent flooding, including swamplands at the edge of the city. Living conditions created over decades disproportionately increased their vulnerability to disaster. The industrial canal over which I traveled was cut right through the Ninth Ward, isolating the predominantly black lower Ninth Ward from the rest of the city, further exasperating their vulnerability. Limited access to public transportation made it still worse. The proximity of chemical contamination and hazardous material sites turned the eventual flood waters into a toxic brew. When it all finally dried out, it left a noxious dust that further compromised the health of the residents. And services readily available after other disasters in other areas of the city and the nation were denied to Ninth Ward residents. Not surprisingly, as Morse states succinctly, minorities and the poor bore a disproportionate brunt of the storm's impacts. In communities with long histories of being ignored, maligned, and abused, it's simply not accurate to blame the devastation on weather and climate alone. It is these kinds of issues that we attend to when we are concerned about something more than just environmentalism. As Mayora Carter explains, the environmental movement has traditionally left people behind in environmental sacrifice zones, which are almost always populated by poor people, usually non-white. Robert Bullard, prime progenitor of this movement, concurs environmental justice incorporates the idea that we're just as much concerned about wetlands, birds, and wilderness areas, but we're also concerned with urban habitats where people live in cities, about children that are being poisoned by lead in housing, and kids playing outside in contaminated playgrounds. And Bullard makes clear we have had to struggle to get these issues on the radar of a lot of large environmental groups. For all of New Orleans' remarkable uniqueness, every major city, Charlotte certainly included, has neighborhoods like the lower Ninth Ward, where, measured on the scale of environmental justice, the burdens far outweigh the benefits. As a black person in America, Mayora Carter asserts, I am twice as likely as a white person to live in an area where air pollution poses the greatest threat to my health. I am 5 times more likely to live within walking distance of a power plant or chemical facility. Poor people and people of color here in our city and around the world are, she says, more likely to breathe dirtier air, to drink dirtier water, and to live, work, or go to school on toxic soils. And she points up quite explicitly, race and class are extremely reliable indicators as to where one might find the good stuff like parks and trees, and where one might find the bad stuff like power plants and waste facilities. If justice means no community is overburdened while being deprived of benefits, this, my friends, is plainly and simply injustice. A religion professing that all people, indeed all beings, have worth, recognizes these not just as economic and social and scientific concerns, but deeply spiritual concerns. A religion affirming justice, equity, and compassion in human relations recognizes environmental justice as a deeply spiritual concern. A religion rooted in the recognition of our part in an interdependent web of all existence knows in the soul of its soul that environmental justice is a deeply spiritual concern. We've come to recognize here that our commitment to integrity demands that we not settle any longer for environmentalism alone, but invest in learning and in partnering in issues of environmental justice as well. Now, please understand. We are not required today or on any foreseeable day to know all the answers. Neither do we have to know exactly what together we are supposed to do. We're not being asked to sit in shame or debilitate ourselves with guilt. We're being summoned by our congregation's commitment not to avoid, not to anesthetize ourselves, not to profess concern about the health of our planet while ignoring the health of our siblings who are suffering, not to care more for the preservation of wild spaces than for those long relegated to woeful places. Perhaps we do well to hear again the summons of that ancient Jewish text counseling. You are not obligated to complete the work. You are not obligated to complete the work. But neither are you free to desist from it. We're invested, some of us, quite deeply this year in paying attention, noticing, listening, learning, in understanding why environmentalism alone, solar panels and recycling and hybrid cars alone will not create environmental justice. In exploring why capitalist constructs of carbon cap and trade will not ever fully balance the scales of burden and benefit. It will take transformation. It will take a systemic change to address a systemic challenge. Now, more than a dozen years after that fateful August day, McDonough 19 has been boarded up and surrounded by an ugly chain link fence. John's old street running toward the river is blighted by empty lots and homes overgrown by bushes and weeds, turned into what a New York Times article called jungle land. In the 10 years between the 2000 census, 5 years before Katrina, and the 2010 census, 5 years after Katrina, the population of the lower Ninth Ward declined from over 14,000 to fewer than 3,000, leaving less than a fourth of the households and a scant 20% of the families. The sides of many of the homes that survived are still tattooed with that ominous X, offering in stark terms an accounting of conditions and of people and bodies found inside. I do not know. I do not know how John, by then a young man in his mid-20s, fared during the storm. Was he still residing in the lower ninth? Did he evacuate? Did he ride it out on a rooftop? Did he endure the horrors of the Superdome? Did he become one more black body floating down the flooded streets? I'd like to believe that against all the odds, he's thriving. That perhaps he even retains some scant recollection of our Thursday afternoons together and understands that I really did care. What I do know is the system failed him and his neighbors, created and then ignored the conditions over centuries, left them and far too many others in this country and around the world bearing unjust environmental burdens and enjoying too few environmental benefits. All of the personal goodwill, all of the individual kindnesses, all of the well-intended charity, all of the solar panels and electric cars and bike lanes in the world aren't ever going to change that system. It will take a commitment to justice. It will take the work of transformation. Those non-swimmers with squeeze box accordion accents aren't really they. They are us. Nature, as writer Yusuf Komanyaka explains, teaches us how to see ourselves within its greater domain. And he continues, we cannot wound Mother Nature without wounding ourselves.
Good morning. My name's Elizabeth Pruitt. Over the past few months, I've spent a great deal of time examining my belief structure about race and the environment. It has not been difficult for me to wrap my head around the fact that environmental destruction takes the greatest toll on people of color. The numbers and statistics are perfectly clear. It's obvious here in Charlotte, just as it was where I was born in southern Alabama. In the 1960s and 70s, North Mobile was dominated by the sights, sounds, and smells of paper mills, chemical plants, and the asphalt refinery where my father worked as an engineer. The predominant population bordering that area, both then and now, is African American. The eastern shore of the bay where I lived and spent childhood days seemed mostly immune from the effects of those noxious industries just a few miles to the north and west in Mobile. Why, I wondered, would anybody live there? Surely somehow they must be different from me. In the small town where I lived, we maybe had a morning or two each week when the stench of the paper mill blew our direction and replaced the scent of salty brine that usually dominated our senses. But it was never the smell that permeated the inside of my classroom or was embedded in the walls of my home. My view was never obstructed by industrial stacks reaching high into the skyline or enormous round holding tanks dominating the landscape. My landscape views were crowded with moss-covered cypress and live oak trees and remnants of fishing piers silhouetted against brilliant, fiery sunsets. The sounds that filled my ears were those of melodic songbirds throughout the day and the incessant repetition of whippoorwills calling as the evening descended. I never heard the hissing and moaning as poisonous liquids moved through enormous above-ground pipes or the grinding of tanker trucks transporting tons of products that we must have to grow and sustain our economy. Since my childhood, my priorities for the environment have always been the preservation of beautiful mountain landscapes, the waters of our rivers, estuaries, and oceans, and the plant and animal life that is so dependent upon them. In 2008, I had the great honor to spend 2 weeks on the vast tundra of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It is a pristine wilderness abound with caribou, grizzly bears, and the summer home of hundreds of species of birds. As one of a small number of people that have had the privilege to visit that unique place, I swore to assist in the battle to keep that tiny part of our world as it is. A beautiful place undamaged by our relentless greed for cheap energy and national resources. Today, as one of the members of the environmental transformation team, I find myself closely examining my priorities. I am struggling to come to terms with my view of the environment and how it has been shaped by my bias, prejudice, and racism. I am wondering now how I have elevated my desire to experience and explore the natural world and have managed to long dismiss the basic needs of people so burdened by our environmental destruction. I turn back to Nikki Finney's words about Katrina. While the richest country in the world speculated whether or not some people are surely born ready, accustomed to flood, famine, and fear. Welcome to today's service. We're honored to have guests with us. Our members would like to greet you following the service. So that we might do so, if you're a visiting, please raise your hand so that all of us may know who you are. Good. Members, please take note of guests seated near you. After the service, invite them to join you for coffee and conversation in Freeman Hall. Should it enhance your experience of future services, you can find both a large print order of service and a personal hearing assistance device on the table at the entrance of the sanctuary. If you'd like to learn more about us, please fill out a yellow card. You'll find them along with offering envelopes on the clipboards at the end of each row. If you would, please begin passing them down your row. Members with a life event to share can indicate that on the reverse side of the card. Put your completed yellow cards in the offering basket when they are passed later in the service. Some returning visitors may be interested in hearing about how to become a member. If so, please talk with our membership coordinator, Kelly Green, right there in the back of the church. Her contact information is on the back of your order. Again, welcome.
I add my welcome to the one you just heard from Elizabeth. I thank you for being here. I want to thank especially those of you who knew or at least suspected what you were getting into today and came anyway. Someone commented after the first service, I was afraid this wasn't going to be uplifting. We shared in dialogue in between the services, a large group of us downstairs in the Bernstein room, and I tried to make clear that this is an expression of the commitment that we've made together as a congregation and to the call that our board so articulately put before us to allow ourselves to become uncomfortable, to listen, to learn, to hesitate before rushing out, to try to act. We'll continue this dialogue led by our environmental transformation team and by our environmental justice core group. There's more coming. This is just the first chapter, and it may even get better. So tomorrow evening, we shift back to our racial justice focus, and I want to urge you, if at all possible, to be here for the showing of the documentary 13th. Some of us have seen this already, but even if you've already seen it, I hope you'll be here because our affiliated community minister and my wife, Melissa Mummert, has arranged a panel that can help us understand the meaning of this film through the lens of their personal experiences. Many of you know that Melissa has a deep commitment to issues of incarceration and justice and injustice related to the prison industrial complex that now exists in our country, in a police state. Tomorrow evening is an opportunity for us to deepen our awareness and our conversation about that. I hope you'll be here. On Tuesday evening, we host again our Housing Works dinner, and if you'd like to be involved in that, there is information in your order about how to be involved. As there, you will also find information about signing up for this upcoming season of Room in the Inn. So find both of those in your order today. We gather in part always to stretch our hearts, to deepen our sense of care and concern and compassion for those in our congregation who are in need. Today, we remember with love and in our prayers Judy Calabrese, who's been hospitalized, Brenda and Lloyd Dillon, as Brenda continues to deal with serious health issues, Annie Flint, who's recovering from a recent fall, David Reynolds, who's recovering from surgery, Barbara and Mike Searing, as Barbara continues her recovery from surgery. We remember Jill Criswell, who mourns the death of her husband, Vic, and I remind you that we will have a service here on this coming Saturday at 10 o'clock in the morning to celebrate Vic's life. And we remember also on this day with love Luis and Mindy Rodriguez as they mourn the death of Luis's beloved grandmother. We could not come together on this day as a congregation without opening our hearts in love and in immense sympathy with a suffering community in Texas. What they experienced in the middle of a service and the scars it leaves on them from now on. I read a lot of reaction this week, a lot of ranting, a lot of raving. I understand a lot of it. I understand the emotion behind it. The most impactful thing I read this week was from the minister of Mother Emanuel in Charleston. One of the few people who can fully empathize with what those Baptists outside of San Antonio are feeling today. And he said, we've already reached out to them, we've already made contact with them, but next week I'm going there myself. And I don't know what I can do, but I do know I can show them that somebody else understands and somebody else cares. That, my friends, is religion at its very finest.
Death, destruction, scores killed as Katrina pounds states along the Gulf Coast.
Catastrophic. Storm surge swamps 9th Ward, St. Bernard. Flooding wipes out 2 communities.
The day after, only ruin left behind. How many dead? Many.
Hurricane Katrina, ground zero. Superdome becomes last resort for thousands unable to leave.
Slipping into anarchy, Katrina refugees fighting for basics of survival. Supplies dwindle as outrage mounts.
Help us, please. After the disaster, chaos and lawlessness rule the streets. Local leaders call relief efforts too little, too late.
Hurricane Katrina's aftermath, 4 years after the deadly storm. Have blacks been forgotten?
I invite us to a time of meditation and aspiration, the opportunity to breathe deeply together. O God of all people. We awake to crisp mornings, to kaleidoscopic scenery, to the gentle drift of falling leaves, and beauty yet again buoys our spirits. Within us, around us, beyond us, we find glimmering hints of hope, cause us to imagine yet again possibilities well beyond simply settling for what is. May we, enduring such bewildering times, not fail to notice or to celebrate whenever we see or hear or feel any indication of that which is good or true or beautiful. Some wake on this morning to another day with far too many burdens and far too few benefits. Some labor through this day carrying the immense weight of a system centuries in the making that has said, that continues to say, your life matters less. May we be inspired and challenged by the best that we know to risk discomfort, to risk uneasiness, to risk the unnerving willingness to admit what we have not heretofore noticed and what we do not now know. As we journey on this way, may both gratitude and justice be our guides. May both beauty and heartbreak lead us on. May our fiercest determination be tempered by deep compassion for ourselves, for one another, for the magnificent and maligned mother of us all. May it be so.
Each day, we make decisions that impact our ability to support ourselves financially, emotionally, and spiritually. Please consider that our decisions to commit time and resources to this UU community impact the ability of the congregation to carry out the transformative work set forth by our board's call to action. The ushers will now collect this morning's offering. Please join us in spirit and our body as you may rise for an affirmation of our faith. Our world is calling us to gather in community and respond from our moral and spiritual wealth. Together we can transform our individual and congregational lives into acts of moral witness, discarding our harmful habits for new behaviors and practices that will sustain life on earth, ever vigilant against injustice.
Go on your way, noticing, celebrating, appreciating, magnifying all the beauty you can find. Go on your way with courage and with compassion, knowing in the heart of your hearts that our world is indeed one world. Please be seated.